The setting sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as two young brothers, just 16, made their way home from basketball practice. Their gym bags slung over their shoulders, they talked excitedly about the upcoming championship game. Both wore their high school basketball jerseys with pride, their identical heights and features marking them instantly as twins. At that same moment, Officer Richard Cooper sat in his patrol car, his prejudices quietly simmering beneath his badge. 20 years on the force had hardened him, twisted his perspective until he saw threats where there were none. When he spotted the twins walking down the street, something in his mind clicked wrongly into place. The boys were doing nothing unusual, just walking, laughing, discussing their coach's new gameplay strategy. Their sneakers scuffed against the sidewalk as they mimicked basketball moves, their backpacks bouncing with each step. One twin was telling the other about a tough math problem he'd solved in class, while his brother playfully rolled his eyes. The patrol car's engine hummed to life. Officer Cooper pulled alongside them slowly, like a shark circling its prey. The twins noticed immediately, their laughter dying in their throats. They'd been taught what to do in situations like this: stay calm, be respectful, but know their rights. Their father's words echoed in their minds. It's not fair, but it's the world we live in. Your dignity is your armor. The setting sun caught the police car's windshield, reflecting golden light as Officer Cooper stepped out. His hand rested casually on his belt, near his holster, a subtle threat that wasn't lost on the boys. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his voice carrying that edge of authority that expected submission. The twins exchanged a quick glance, years of unspoken communication passing between them. The slightly taller twin spoke first, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We're heading home, sir. We just finished basketball practice at Lincoln High." He gestured to their uniforms, the school logo clearly visible. But Officer Cooper wasn't interested in explanations. His eyes narrowed, scanning their gym bags as if they might contain stolen goods instead of basketball shoes and water bottles. "I've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, though no such reports existed. "Let me see some ID." The twins knew this line. It was as familiar as it was unfair. The younger twin, calmer under pressure, carefully reached for his phone. "Sir, I'm going to record this interaction, if you don't mind, and we'd like to know what suspicious activity you're referring to." This seemed to trigger something in Officer Cooper. His face flushed red, authority challenged by teenagers who knew their rights. "Put that phone away," he barked, reaching for his handcuffs. "Both of you, hands against the wall. Now." Neighbors began peeking through their windows, some coming out onto their porches. Several pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. The twins complied with the officer's orders, their movements slow and deliberate, but maintained their dignity. They didn't argue or resist. They simply made sure every action was captured on the phones of those watching. The older twin spoke clearly as Officer Cooper roughly patted them down. "We're cooperating, sir, but we'd like to know why we're being detained. Playing basketball and walking home isn't a crime." His voice carried across the street, steady and clear, making sure the growing crowd of witnesses could hear every word. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Cooper's hands shook slightly as he reached for his handcuffs, his breathing becoming increasingly labored, though he didn't notice it yet. The sun had nearly set now, painting the scene in deep oranges and purples, as a moment of everyday injustice stood poised to take an unexpected turn that would change lives forever. This was just the beginning of a story that would soon spiral into something neither the twins nor Officer Cooper could have predicted, a moment that would test the very essence of human compassion and challenge deep-rooted prejudices in ways no one saw coming. Would you like me to continue with part 2 in the same engaging style? The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around the first twin's wrists, the sound echoing through the now quiet street. His brother watched, heart pounding but face calm, knowing his turn would come next. Officer Cooper's movements had become more aggressive, his breathing increasingly heavy as sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. In the car, Cooper barked, pushing the first twin toward the patrol vehicle with more force than necessary. The young man didn't resist, but kept his head high. Neighbors had gathered in small clusters now, their phones recording steadily, their whispers of disapproval growing louder. One elderly woman had already dialed the police station to report the officer's behavior. The second twin spoke up, his voice carrying clearly across the growing crowd. "Sir, you still haven't told us what we've done wrong." He kept his tone respectful but firm, just as their mother had taught them. She'd always said, "Your words are your strongest weapon. Use them wisely." Officer Cooper spun around to face him, face flushed red with anger and something else, something that made his left arm tingle uncomfortably. The exertion and stress were taking their toll, though his rage blinded him to the warning signs his body was sending. "You want to be smart. You can join your brother in the back seat." But as he reached for the second set of handcuffs, the world suddenly tilted sideways. The metal cuffs clattered to the pavement as Cooper grabbed his chest, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. The anger in his eyes was replaced by something else. Fear. Pure, primal fear as he realized what was happening. The first twin, already half in the police car, saw it happen. "Brother," he called out, "something's wrong with him." Despite being handcuffed, he quickly slid back out of the vehicle. Officer Cooper was on his knees now, his face a mask of pain and panic. The second twin, who spent his weekends volunteering at the local hospital, recognized the signs immediately. "He's having a heart attack," he announced, dropping to his knees beside the officer who, just moments ago, had been treating them like criminals. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the twins, one still in handcuffs, worked together to help the man who had wronged them. The first twin used his foot to push Officer Cooper's shoulder, carefully rolling him onto his back while his brother checked for a pulse. "Where's your aspirin, sir?" the second twin asked urgently. "In your car. Your pocket?" Cooper could barely speak, but managed to pat his shirt pocket with a trembling hand. The twin reached in, finding a small bottle of emergency aspirin, standard issue for officers over 50. The first twin, despite his restricted movement, managed to cradle Cooper's head with his cuffed hands while his brother administered the aspirin. "Stay with us, officer," he encouraged, all thoughts of the unjust arrest forgotten in the crisis of the moment. "Help is coming." Someone in the crowd had already called 911, and the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The second twin kept checking Cooper's pulse, speaking clearly and calmly. "Try to take slow breaths, sir. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Stay with us." Officer Cooper's eyes, now wide with fear rather than anger, darted between the two young men helping him. His lips moved, trying to form words, perhaps an apology, but the twins shushed him gently. "Don't try to talk right now," the second twin advised. "Just focus on breathing." The gathered crowd had grown larger, their phones now lowered, many watching with hands over their mouths as the scene unfolded. The same elderly woman who had called to report Cooper's behavior earlier was now leading a prayer circle on the sidewalk. In those tense minutes before the ambulance arrived, something profound shifted in Officer Cooper's understanding of the world. Through the haze of his pain, he watched as these young men, whom he had profiled and handled roughly just moments ago, now worked to save his life with a dignity and compassion he knew he hadn't deserved. The sun had fully set now, but the street was lit by porch lights and the flashing red and blue of approaching emergency vehicles. As the ambulance rounded the corner, Officer Cooper managed to whisper something that would mark the beginning of his transformation. "I'm sorry. The keys. Right pocket. Would you like me to continue with part 3? Maintaining this level of engagement and emotional depth?" The ambulance lights painted the street in alternating flashes of red and blue as paramedics rushed toward Officer Cooper. The twins stepped back, giving the medical team space to work, one still in handcuffs while his brother explained the situation with remarkable clarity. "He started showing symptoms about 6 minutes ago. We gave him his aspirin, and he's been conscious but having trouble breathing. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and starting an IV. One of them looked up at the twins with admiration. "You boys did good. Those first few minutes are crucial." She noticed the handcuffs then, her eyebrows rising in question as she glanced between the boys and the officer lying on the ground. A surgeon from another precinct had arrived on scene. An older man with kind eyes. He'd heard both sides of the story from witnesses while the paramedics worked. Without hesitation, he took the handcuff keys from Cooper's pocket and freed the twin who was still restrained. "I think we can all agree these aren't necessary," he said softly, shaking his head at how the situation had unfolded. As the paramedics prepared to load Cooper into the ambulance, the officer reached out weakly and grabbed one of the twins' hands. His grip was shaky but urgent. "Wait," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The paramedics paused, monitoring his vitals carefully. I need you to know." Cooper struggled with each word, but his eyes were clear and focused. "What I did, how I acted, it was wrong. I saw what I wanted to see, not who you really are." Tears welled up in his eyes, whether from pain or emotion. It wasn't clear. "You could have let me die. Would have served me right." The twins exchanged glances, and the one whose hand Cooper held spoke gently. "That's not who we are, sir. That's not who our parents raised us to be." His brother nodded in agreement. "And that's not who you have to be either. Focus on getting better. Maybe something good can come from all this." As the paramedics finally loaded Cooper into the ambulance, he kept his eyes on the twins until the doors closed. The older brother turned to the surgeon and asked, "Would it be okay if we visited him once he's stable?" The surgeon smiled warmly, clearly impressed by their character. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people came forward to share their videos of the entire incident. The elderly woman who had been leading the prayer circle approached the twins with tears in her eyes. "I've lived on this street for 40 years, she said, her voice trembling. "Never have I seen such grace in the face of injustice. Your parents must be so proud." Just then, a car came speeding around the corner. Their parents had finally been reached. Their mother rushed out before the car fully stopped, pulling both boys into a tight embrace. Their father followed, his face a complex mixture of relief, pride, and lingering anger at what could have happened. The surgeon approached their parents, explaining everything that had occurred. As he spoke, their mother kept one arm around each of her sons, holding them close as if they might disappear. Their father listened intently, his expression softening as the story unfolded. "Your sons may have started a chain reaction here," the surgeon said thoughtfully. "Officer Cooper, he's been on the force for 20 years, set in his ways. But what happened tonight?" He shook his head in amazement. Sometimes it takes something big to make someone question everything they thought they knew. The twins' father spoke up, his voice firm, but not angry. "Will there be an official investigation into the initial profiling incident?" The surgeon nodded solemnly. "Already in motion. But your son's actions tonight, they've given us an opportunity to do more than just punish. They've given us a chance to actually change something." As the family prepared to head home, the younger twin turned to look at the now empty spot where Officer Cooper had lay. His brother caught his expression and knew what he was thinking. This wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, it could become something more than another sad story of prejudice. Maybe it could become a story of transformation. Would you like me to continue with part 4, keeping up this momentum and emotional depth? 3 days passed before the twins heard any news about Officer Cooper. They were sitting in their kitchen, doing homework, when their father came in with his phone in hand. The boys looked up, instantly recognizing the serious expression on his face. "The hospital called," he said softly. "Officer Cooper is asking to see you both." Their mother, who had been quietly grading papers at the kitchen table, set down her red pen. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," she said, her protective instinct clear in her voice. But the twins shared one of their silent looks. They'd already made up their minds. The hospital corridors were quiet except for the soft squeak of their shoes on the polished floor. A nurse led them to Cooper's room, explaining that his condition had stabilized, but he needed to stay calm. Their parents waited outside, letting their sons handle this moment in their own way. When they entered the room, they almost didn't recognize the man in the hospital bed. Gone was the intimidating officer who had confronted them on the street. Instead, they saw someone who looked smaller somehow, more human. Medical tubes and monitors surrounded him, but his eyes were clear and alert. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Cooper said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. The cardiac unit's machines beeped steadily in the background. "After what I did, I've been lying here, thinking about it over and over. How differently it could have ended." The older twin pulled up a chair while his brother leaned against the wall. "We've been thinking about it too," the younger one said, "about how things need to change." There was no accusation in his voice, just a simple statement of truth. Cooper nodded slowly, wincing slightly at the movement. "I've had a lot of time to think in here, about my 20 years on the force, about all the times I might have done the same thing, made the same assumptions." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You know what scared me most? Not the heart attack. It was realizing how easily I could have ruined your lives just because of my prejudice." The older twin leaned forward in his chair. "Why did you want to see us?" he asked directly but gently. It was a fair question. They all knew this meeting needed a purpose beyond just an apology. Cooper reached for a folder on his bedside table, his hands shaking slightly. "I've written a full report about what happened. The truth, all of it. I've admitted to racial profiling, to abuse of power. I'm not just sorry. I want to make this right." He looked at both brothers. "But I need your help." The twins listened as Cooper explained his idea. He wanted to start a program, one that would bring officers and young people together, not on the streets in confrontations, but in community centers, in schools, in spaces where they could actually talk and learn from each other. "I know it sounds crazy," Cooper said, watching their expressions carefully. "The racist cop who had a change of heart. It sounds like a bad TV movie. But this is real. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prevent other officers from making the same mistakes I did." The younger twin stepped forward from the wall. "You're right. We don't have to forgive you." His words hung in the air for a moment before he continued. "But maybe that's not what this is about. Maybe it's about making sure another kid doesn't have to fear walking home from basketball practice." His brother nodded in agreement. "We'll help," he said simply. "But we need to do this right. No sugarcoating, no hiding the hard truths. Real change means facing everything, the good and the bad." Cooper's eyes welled up with tears, but these were different from the tears of fear and shame from that night on the street. "I promise," he said, his voice stronger now. "Whatever it takes, I want to be part of the solution, not the problem anymore." As they talked, the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room. In that quiet space, surrounded by beeping machines and the faint sounds of hospital activity, something new was taking shape, a partnership born from confrontation, a chance for real change growing from the soil of near tragedy. Would you like me to continue with Part 5, maintaining this level of meaningful dialogue and character development? 2 weeks after their hospital visit, the twins sat in their school's gymnasium, surrounded by a mix of police officers and students. Officer Cooper, still looking a bit pale but standing tall, stood at the center of the circle. The school had agreed to host their first community dialogue session, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'm here today," Cooper began, his voice carrying across the quiet gym, "because these two young men showed me what real character looks like." He gestured to the twins, who sat quietly, watching the faces around them. "They saved my life after I had wrongly profiled and arrested them. But more than that, they saved me from remaining the person I was." The older twin noticed how some of the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual community outreach meeting with rehearsed speeches and forced smiles. This was raw, real, and uncomfortable, exactly as it needed to be. A young student raised her hand, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. How do we know this isn't just for show? How do we know things will actually change? It was the question everyone had been thinking, and the younger twin found himself nodding in appreciation of her courage to ask it. Cooper didn't rush to defend himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone and played the video of that evening, the one that showed his prejudiced behavior and subsequent heart attack. The gym fell silent as they watched. When it finished, he spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to work together to make real change. The older twin stood up then, addressing both officers and students. Change isn't just about programs or meetings, he said, looking around the circle. It's about being honest about what's wrong and being brave enough to fix it. My brother and I could have walked away after that night. Officer Cooper could have kept quiet about what he did wrong. But we're all here because we chose something different. His brother joined him, adding, "We're not here to pretend everything's okay now. We're here because we believe things can get better, but only if we're willing to do the hard work." He looked at the officers. That means admitting when the system is wrong. Then he turned to the students. And it means being willing to help make it right when someone genuinely wants to change. One of the older officers raised his hand, his face stern but thoughtful. I've been on the force 30 years, he said slowly. Never thought I'd see something like this. But I've got to ask, what exactly are we trying to build here? The younger twin smiled slightly. Understanding, he replied. Not just between police and young people, but between humans. Officer Cooper didn't see us as people that night. He saw what his prejudice told him to see. But when he needed help, we didn't see a badge or a uniform. We saw someone who needed help. The conversation opened up then, like a dam breaking. Students shared stories of being profiled, while officers talked about their fears and preconceptions. It wasn't always comfortable, and sometimes voices rose in frustration or pain, but it was real. Cooper stood in the middle of it all, facilitating with a humility that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. As the session wound down, a freshman girl approached the twins. You know, she said quietly, when I first heard about what happened, I thought it was just another story that would fade away. But this, she gestured around the gym, where officers and students were still talking in small groups. This feels different. The older twin watched as Officer Cooper engaged with a group of skeptical students, answering their tough questions with honesty and vulnerability. It is different, he replied. Because this time, everyone involved wanted to change the ending of the story. Their father, who had been watching from the bleachers, came down to join them. You boys started something powerful here, he said proudly, watching the ongoing discussions. But remember, this is just the beginning. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, keeping up the momentum of this transformative journey? The news about their program spread quickly through the community. 1 month after the first gym meeting, the twins found themselves in front of the city council, sharing their story. The council chamber was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Officer Cooper stood beside them at the podium, looking healthier now, but also somehow softer, more approachable in his uniform. The younger twin spoke first, his voice clear and strong. We're not here to talk about what went wrong that night. We're here to show you what can go right when people choose to learn from their mistakes. The older brother pulled up their presentation on the large screen. Photos from their weekly meetings filled the display. Officers and teenagers playing basketball together, sharing meals, and most importantly, talking openly about their fears and hopes. This isn't just about police training, he explained. It's about breaking down walls that have stood for generations. A council member leaned forward, her expression skeptical. And you're saying this program has actually changed attitudes? In just 1 month. The question hung in the air, heavy with doubt. Officer Cooper stepped forward. May I? He asked the twins, who nodded. A month ago, I was that officer who saw threats instead of teenagers, who saw stereotypes instead of students. His voice cracked slightly. Then these young men saved my life, after I had treated them like criminals. But they didn't just save my life. They showed me a better way to live it. From the back of the room, another officer stood up. I was there that first day in the gym, he said. Thought it was going to be just another PR stunt. But I've watched these kids, these young men, build bridges I thought were burned forever. My own daughter hadn't spoken to me about her fears of the police until we attended one of their sessions. Now we actually talk. The twins shared a quick glance, remembering how that particular officer had been one of their biggest skeptics. Now he was one of their strongest supporters. Their mother, sitting in the front row, wiped away tears as she watched her son stand tall before the city's leaders. The younger twin continued their presentation, showing statistics from their first month. 87 students and 32 officers have participated so far. But here's the real number that matters: 0 incidents of racial profiling reported in our precinct since the program began. We know it's early, but it's a start. His brother added, "We're not naive. We know one program can't fix everything. But when officers and young people sit down together, share meals together, play sports together, they start seeing each other as human beings. That's where real change begins." The council chamber had grown quiet, the earlier skepticism replaced by thoughtful attention. A young council member spoke up. "What do you need from us to expand this program?" The twins laid out their plan. Support for more community centers to host meetings, funding for sports equipment and meals, and most importantly, official recognition of the program as part of police training. Officer Cooper added details about how it could be integrated into the police academy curriculum. As they finished their presentation, an elderly council member who had been silent throughout stood up slowly. "I've sat in this chamber for 20 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Seen plenty of programs come and go. But this," he gestured to the twins and Officer Cooper standing together, "this is different. Because it's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about building something new." The council voted unanimously to support the program's expansion. As people filed out of the chamber, a young reporter approached the twins. "Your story is inspiring," she said, "but what happens when you go to college next year? Will the program continue?" The older twin smiled. "That's the beauty of it," he replied. "This isn't our program anymore. It belongs to everyone who's been part of it. The real test isn't what we've built. It's what happens next." Would you like me to continue with Part 7, maintaining this momentum of community transformation and growth? 6 months after that fateful night, the community center buzzed with activity. The twins watched from the sidelines as Officer Cooper, now fully recovered, coached a basketball game between local teens and police officers. The sound of squeaking sneakers and cheerful shouts filled the air, a far cry from the tense silence of their first meeting. The younger twin nudged his brother, pointing to a familiar face in the crowd. The same elderly woman who had prayed for Officer Cooper on that dramatic night was now sitting in the bleachers, beaming as she watched her grandson, a rookie police officer, playing alongside the teenagers he once would have viewed with suspicion. "Remember when we thought this might not work?" the older twin whispered to his brother. Their program had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. What started in their school gym had spread to 5 other districts, with more requesting to join every week. A commotion near the court drew their attention. One of the younger officers had taken a hard fall during the game. Instead of tension or accusations, both teams rushed to help him up, laughing together as he brushed off his knees. These small moments of natural connection were exactly what they'd hoped to create. Their father appeared beside them, camera in hand. He'd been documenting the program's journey from the beginning. "The news crew is here," he said quietly. "They want to do a follow-up story on how things have changed since that night." The twins exchanged glances. They'd received plenty of media attention over the past months, but this felt different. This wasn't about the incident anymore. It was about what had grown from it. As they set up for the interview, Officer Cooper called a timeout on the game. Players and spectators gathered around, creating an impromptu audience. The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, positioned herself between the twins and Cooper. 6 months ago, a routine patrol turned into a life-changing moment for everyone involved, she began. How does it feel to see where things are now? The younger twin looked around the community center before answering. You know what's amazing? This isn't special anymore. These officers and kids playing basketball together, sharing stories, learning from each other, it's just become normal. That's real change. Officer Cooper nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. These young men taught me that changing hearts isn't about big speeches or formal training. It's about creating spaces where we can just be human together. He gestured to the court. Out there, we're not officers and teenagers. We're just people playing basketball. The older twin added, the best part is watching new people come in. They always start out awkward, unsure. But by the end of their first session, they're laughing together, sharing snacks, exchanging phone numbers. It's like watching walls crumble in real time. A young officer who had been listening stepped forward. I was one of the biggest critics when this started, he admitted. Thought it was just some PR stunt. But last week, I ran into one of our regular kids while responding to a call in his neighborhood. Instead of tension, there was trust. We could actually talk about what was happening and solve the problem together. The reporter turned back to the twins. Your college acceptance letters came last week. What happens to the program when you leave? The younger twin smiled. Look around, he said, gesturing to the dozens of people in the center. This isn't our program anymore. It belongs to everyone here. We just helped plant the seed. They're the ones who've helped it grow. As if to prove his point, the basketball game resumed spontaneously behind them, with officers and teens calling out plays and friendly trash talk. The elderly woman in the bleachers was now chatting with a group of teenage girls, sharing stories and laughing together. Would you like me to continue with part 8, showing how this transformation continues to ripple through the community? 1 year had passed since that life-changing night. The twins stood on their high school graduation stage, preparing to give their valedictorian speech together, a first in their school's history. The audience was a sea of faces, but what caught their eye was the entire police department sitting in uniform, with Officer Cooper in the front row next to their parents. The older twin stepped up to the microphone first. A year ago, we learned something that no textbook could teach us, he began, his voice steady and clear. We learned that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from choosing compassion when anger would be easier. His brother joined him at the podium. Our story could have been just another headline, another tragic example of what's wrong in our world. Instead, it became a lesson about what's possible when people choose to see each other's humanity. From their spot on stage, they could see Officer Cooper wiping his eyes. He looked different now, not just physically recovered, but transformed. The hard edges that had defined him that night were gone, replaced by something warmer, more genuine. Our community program started with a crisis, the younger twin continued. But it grew into something beautiful. Last month, we had our 100th session. Do you know what was special about it? Nothing. Nothing at all. Because officers and young people playing basketball together, sharing meals, and really talking to each other has become normal. The older brother gestured to the police officers in attendance. These officers aren't here today because they have to be. They're here because they've become part of our extended family. They've coached us in basketball, helped us with college applications, and shown us that a badge doesn't define a person. Their actions do. Their eyes found their parents in the crowd. Their mother was crying openly now, while their father filmed everything with slightly shaky hands. Next to them, the elderly woman from that first night sat proudly. She'd become a regular at their program, bringing her famous cookies to every session. As we head to college, the younger twin said, people keep asking what will happen to the program. But look around this room. See how officers and students sit together, laugh together. That's not our achievement. That's everyone's achievement. The program doesn't need us anymore. It just needs people willing to keep choosing understanding over fear. Officer Cooper stood up then, and to everyone's surprise, other officers followed. One by one, they raised their hands in a silent salute, not just to the twins, but to the possibility of change they represented. Students in the audience stood too, followed by parents and teachers, until the whole gymnasium was on its feet. The older twin felt his voice catch as he delivered their final words. We're leaving for different colleges in the fall, but we're not worried about what we're leaving behind, because what started as one difficult night has grown into hundreds of new beginnings. Our community didn't just talk about change. We lived it. We're still living it. As they finished speaking, something remarkable happened. The applause that filled the gymnasium wasn't the usual polite graduation ceremony clapping. It was the sound of genuine celebration, of pride in what their community had become, of hope for what it could still be. After the ceremony, as people mingled in the school courtyard, a young rookie officer approached the twins. You know, she said, I joined the force right after your program started. I can't imagine doing this job any other way than what you've shown us. That's your real legacy. Would you like me to continue with the final part 9, bringing this transformative story to its powerful conclusion? Asterisk, the late summer sun cast long shadows across the community center's parking lot as the twins packed their cars for college. They'd insisted on running one last program session before leaving, and the turnout was overwhelming. The basketball court was packed, the bleachers were full, and the smell of the elderly woman's famous cookies filled the air. Officer Cooper stood in the middle of the court, calling everyone to gather around. His eyes were misty as he looked at the crowd. Officers, teenagers, parents, and community members, all mixed together like they'd been doing this their whole lives. The barriers that had once seemed so permanent were now just memories. 2 years ago, Cooper began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. I was a different person. I wore this badge like armor, seeing threats instead of people. He paused, looking at the twins. Then these young men showed me what real strength looks like. They showed all of us. The younger twin watched as a group of rookie officers chatted easily with some high school students near the water cooler. One of them was explaining police procedures, while the teenagers shared their experiences about growing up in the neighborhood. This natural exchange of perspectives was exactly what they'd hoped to achieve. The older twin stepped forward. When we started this program, people said it wouldn't last. They said we were too young, too naive. He smiled at the crowd. But look at us now. 10 districts have adopted our program. The police academy includes our community sessions in their training. And most importantly, our neighborhood feels different. Their father, still filming everything as always, captured the moment a young officer helped a teenager perfect his jump shot. Nearby, their mother was deep in conversation with a group of parents and officers, planning next month's community dinner. The beautiful thing, the younger twin added, is that none of this needs us anymore. What started as our story has become everyone's story. Each person here has helped write new chapters, create new connections. A teenage girl raised her hand, her voice trembling slightly. But what happens when you're gone? Who's going to lead the sessions? Before the twins could answer, Officer Cooper stepped in. Look around, he said gently. We're all leaders now. Every person here knows how to build bridges, how to listen, how to see beyond first impressions. That's what these young men taught us. Leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about showing others what's possible. The afternoon turned into evening as stories were shared, games were played, and promises to stay in touch were made. The twins noticed their parents talking quietly with Officer Cooper, probably sharing parent-to-parent advice about keeping in touch with kids away at college. As the sun began to set, everyone gathered for one final group photo. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder with teenagers they once would have viewed with suspicion. Parents chatted with police leadership about upcoming community events. The elderly woman passed out the last of her cookies, making everyone promise to keep her recipe a secret. The older twin looked at his brother, both of them taking in the scene. "Remember that night?" he asked quietly. "When we thought everything was going wrong." His brother nodded, watching Officer Cooper laugh with a group of teens, who knew that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. As they prepared to leave, people lined up to hug them goodbye, but it wasn't sadness in the air. It was pride, hope, and the quiet confidence of a community that had learned to see each other's humanity. They had all discovered that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like choosing compassion over fear, understanding over judgment, and hope over hatred. The twins drove away that evening, their rearview mirrors reflecting the sunset-lit community center where so much had changed. But they weren't leaving their work behind. They were watching it take on a life of its own, growing stronger with each new connection, each shared story, each moment of understanding. In the end, what started as one tense night had blossomed into a movement of hearts and minds, proving that real change isn't just possible. It's inevitable when people choose to see the best in each other.